Hi, good morning, everyone. We're just holding on for 60 seconds or so because we have a lot of people trying to connect and are in the waiting room. We've got over 100 people already, but I think people are still joining. I can see a whole number of faces. It's great. I hope Kim and I are going to kick things off, and I hope most of you can understand our version of English. That'll be useful. We come from a God's own country in Yorkshire, so if you'll get used to it by the end of this. Right, shall we kick off? I think we'll kick off. Great. So, again, good morning. My name's Patel, and I wear a number of hats, but I'm in my capacity today as the chair of Breaking Barriers Innovations. Before I say a few words and hand over to Kim, I think it'd be good just to do some housekeeping issues and get them out of the way. And we have a little slide just as a reminder. So you probably will have noticed your microphone has been muted. That's been centrally controlled, so we don't have a lot of background noise. We intend to circulate the slides and the recording of the event. So it's really important, if you don't wish to feature in the recording, to please turn your camera off. Of course, as I've mentioned, we've got a lot of people, so but we will have some time for Q&A after each individual speaker. We may be able to take one or two questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have 10-15 minutes to take a number of questions. If you want to ask a question, please use your chat box facility. I'll be monitoring that, and my two colleagues, George and Raheem, will also be looking at it, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. Obviously, we're not going to answer every question today, but please record them, because what we're going to try and do is capture them all, compile them into some kind of fact sheet, so we don't lose, obviously the very key important issues that are going to be raised. And of course, amongst us, all those people who are media savvy, there's some hashtags for you there to tweet or whatever. Great. That's housekeeping out of the way. So look, again, big thanks, many thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's incredible. We have a huge amount of interest in this webinar, which I think shows just how important this issue is for everyone. More so, especially more so since the COVID-19 pandemic, which I believe has brought home to everyone just how difficult it is to be isolated or lonely. Our title for the webinar is A Little More Conversation, A Little More Action. Though when I looked at that, I actually think we need a lot more action, and hopefully we can use today to think about what we might need to make that happen. I've seen over the website and over time, there's lots and lots of events going on about social isolation and loneliness, which is a good thing. And while, of course, that's our main focus for today, we don't approach this as experts in the subject, but rather what this means for organisations and how we need to work more closely together to ensure that addressing social isolation and loneliness is part of everyone's organisational strategy as part of a wider approach to the social determinants of health and prevention. We've got some fabulous speakers for you today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. But firstly, I want to thank the Jo Cox Commission and the Connection Coalition, who've done so much to raise the issue of loneliness, and without them, this event wouldn't have been possible. In normal times, of course, and really important for me, we'd be meeting together face to face. But the pandemic has meant that we have to use technology much more. And while it might not be ideal for everyone, it does allow us at least to meet and listen to each other, albeit in a different way. But also, we can't talk about the issues of loneliness and social isolation without thinking about the wider impact of the pandemic. It's, of course, had a huge impact on all of us. and far too many people have sadly lost their lives. But the health impacts go beyond the virus. For example, people with life-threatening long-term conditions have had treatment disrupted, operations delayed, and we've seen the NHS and care services that we all rely on come under incredible strains. The economic impacts have also been significant, with the government making unprecedented interventions to try and protect jobs and keep the economy going. In fact, I think I read somewhere the other day that the total expenditure equates to almost £3,000 per person for every UK citizen, which far exceeds the health budget for this last year. And in fact, we've got an additional spending on health services at a tune of somewhere around £32 billion. What I think we must not lose sight of is the impact on those who are most vulnerable. There are 1.5 million people being shielded, my wife being one of them. But the NHS England estimates there's a further 1 million people who are vulnerable to the more severe risks of the pandemic. And with that vulnerability and the wider restrictions that have had to be brought into force has come greater social isolation and loneliness. But on the positive side, if there is a positive side, I think we've seen a tremendous effort by the voluntary sector and local community groups to help people. It's estimated there's more than 10 million people who've been volunteering in their community during the pandemic. Phenomenal number. And more say they'll carry on this vital work. And if I have one fear, it's that. How do we keep what has worked well and support people to stay actively involved in their communities? How do we ensure that the incredible value of volunteering, for example, is sustained? Again, that's some of the questions that we can consider today. Of course, one of the reasons for the webinar today is to launch a report and action plan from the work BBI have done in Portsmouth on social isolation and loneliness. You should have all received a copy of the report. If you haven't, please get in touch and we'll make sure you get a copy. My colleague John Bashford, Dr. John Bashford, is going to tell you more about it shortly. We're also very, very fortunate to have Sue Harriman, the Chief Executive of Solent NHS Trust, who's worked with us very closely on leading the work in Portsmouth. And we're very fortunate to have two other excellent speakers, Eleanor Roy, the Health and Social Care Manager at CIPFA, who's been leading on insights into investing in prevention. I think it's a really important area. And Sarah White, the Head of Public Policy at Sense. And it's incredible how Sense have managed to adapt to continue to provide the much needed services they provide to those with complex disabilities. So I look forward to hearing from both of them about their important work. I think we had something like 200 people register for this event with 150 different organisations representing, the NHS, local government, the community and voluntary sector. So it's phenomenal. What I don't want to do is just have today and, we learn a bit and we forget about it. This event has to be a springboard that we can build to have a dedicated movement across all systems and sectors to continue to prioritise, inspire and lead the way in tackling the challenge of social isolation and loneliness so that no one feels beyond help or support. I'll shut up now and we'll get on to the really inspiring speakers. I'm really, really privileged to invite a fellow Northerner, Kim Leadbeater, who probably doesn't need any introduction. She's an ambassador for the Jo Cox Foundation, which was set up after the tragic murder of her sister, Jo Cox MP, on June the 16th, 2016. She's the spokesperson for the annual Get Together, a weekend of community events that's been held across the UK every year. Kim, really looking forward to hearing from you and thank you for having us.
No, thank you very much, Lord Patel, for that wonderful introduction and those brilliant opening remarks. I'm going to try and keep things fairly brief because we've got lots to get through, but thank you so much to everybody for joining us this morning for this really important event. Huge thanks to Breaking Barriers Innovations for joint hosting with ourselves at the Jo Cox Foundation. Just a quick sort of introduction from our perspective. We've done some amazing things in Jo's name since she was killed in 2016, and we've got a huge amount to be proud of. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of is the work we've done on loneliness and social isolation. It was an issue that was close to Jo's heart. She'd started cross-party work on this issue during her short time as an MP, and that was picked up after her murder by Rachel Reeves for the Labour Party and Seema Kennedy on the Conservative benches. And, you know, the work that we did in terms of partnering with loads of amazing organisations who were already working on loneliness and social isolation, that work was already being done, but we were able to turbocharge that work through the Jo Cox Commission on Loneliness. And cut the long story short on all the hard work that went behind it, we had the appointment of the world's first ever Minister for Loneliness and the world's first ever government strategy on loneliness. And a huge amount of work has been done in these past 4 years on this really important issue. And as Lord Patel says, because of lockdown, because of COVID, we're now looking at a whole different situation around this really important issue, which we need to think about in a slightly different way, but also consolidate on all that amazing work that was being done. In terms of where the Connection Coalition fits in with that, back in March when we went into lockdown, I think as a foundation we felt there was a lot of conversations around what we weren't able to do anymore. There was a huge sense of loss. There was a huge sense of, sadly, grief for many people, but for all of us, a loss of our human connections, a loss of our freedoms, and it was a really challenging time. And we were really pleased to start working with Iona Lawrence, who was the first chief exec of Jo's foundation, and has a huge amount of passion for working on human connection. And Iona and the foundation worked very closely together, Eleanor, who is here with us today, to form the Connection Coalition. And this was basically an opportunity for organisations to come together and focus more on how we could stay connected during these really challenging times. So that's where the Connection Coalition came from. I'm extremely proud of that work that's been done. And as a result of that, we are all here together this morning. So thank you so much. Sadly, Baroness Barron, who is now the Minister for Loneliness, couldn't join us this morning, but she did pass on a lovely message saying, hope it's a really successful event. And to everyone who is doing all this important work, keep going with it. She has been hugely supportive, I have to say, since she took over. And we have a very positive relationship with her. So I will certainly make sure we feed back some of the comments from today's event to her. So that's it really from me. I hope you've got your brews at the ready. Feel free to go and get biscuits if you need to. Yeah, let's have a great morning together.
Super, thank you very much, Kim. And yes, it's nice to have a minister there for loneliness, and I've managed to connect with Baroness Barron a couple of times, and I think it's certainly gathering pace. So, you know, wonderful to have that in place. Right, let's move on to the speakers. Dr. John Bashford to kick off on the report from Portsmouth. John, are you there?
I am, yes. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Great.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I just want to very briefly start off by explaining a bit about who Breaking Barriers Innovations are. We came about 4 years ago, and we've been working around the country with a lot of NHS organisations and local authorities on place-based change and how to make place-based change a reality and greater service integration and more collaborative working together. And to aid with that, we developed a playbook, which the Portsmouth work that we've done is based on. And the playbook really recognises that we've got many stakeholders, all of which often working to their own strategies and their own priorities, but they do face a lot of common barriers. Very often we're dealing with short-term priorities rather than thinking about the longer term. There was no real blueprint for how to make place-based change a reality. Everyone was operating in the different systems, budgets are siloed, and certainly before COVID, I think there was a real fear of risk and failure amongst some of the top leaders. So the playbook uses 3 building blocks that we bring together, the first of which is to get everybody on the same page. We call it strategic alignment, but this isn't about making more strategy. It's not ideological. It's about using the evidence base and getting the right sector leaders in the room to make decisions about what is the real wicked issue that they face and what would be the dominant strategy that would have the most impact to address that, and how do we then translate that into culture and practice so it's not just a document sitting on a shelf. And we then look at resident and community engagement, the degree to which local people and service users are included and empowered to be involved in decision making, how sustainable that is, and what are the kinds of supports that communities need to be meaningfully involved. And alongside that, we look at workforce, thinking of the skills, the competencies and the organizational cultures that we need to back up our workforce. We've done a lot of this work in partnership with Health Education England, and the next part of the NHS People Plan is actually being launched today. So thinking about workforce and the implications of that, especially I think around dealing with social isolation and loneliness is really important. But those building blocks culminate in an action plan, and we're here today to launch the report from Portsmouth in the action plan, and there's always a report, but it's the action plan that actually really matters, because that's what people locally sign up to be committed to and to make change. It's co-designed with service users and local people. It has the workforce and skills element. It draws on innovation from industry, but also from the community and voluntary sector. It needs to be realistic in terms of being affordable and sustainable, and actually have a governance route map to it to make things happen. We will be sharing the slides with everybody, so don't worry about sort of the kind of rapid pace I'm going through. We're currently working in 6 areas on the playbook program, and we're interested to do more, and hopefully we can have some discussion today about some of the opportunities for that. But the Portsmouth piece is the one that was their dominant strategy was around social isolation and loneliness. That was the thing that locally people thought if we could do something on this, that's going to have the biggest impact across the system. It was led by Solent NHS Trust, and you'll hear shortly from the Chief Executive of the Trust, but also Portsmouth Clinical Commissioning Group, Portsmouth City Council, and as I said, it was co-sponsored with Health Education England. Why it matters, and I'm sure these are things that everyone's familiar with, but there's a long history of the health harms associated with social isolation and loneliness, been linked to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, but it's also leads to increased risks of depression. It's been known to increase cognitive decline in Alzheimer's and greater risk of heart disease and stroke. And people who are isolated and lonely are more likely to die prematurely, less likely to survive from long-term conditions. But we talk about people being isolated and lonely, that in actual fact, they're knocking on every door. They're 80% more likely to visit the GP, 60% more likely to end up in accident and emergency. A third are likely to have emergency admissions, and 350% more likely to enter a local authority residential care home. So this is actually a group that's having a huge impact on services. And that's really why coming at this from a point of view of organisations is really important, and how we can successfully get this to be a much bigger priority in terms of services and commissioning. The work was in Portsmouth, but a place-based approach is, what we've learned from that certainly is it's very local. What place means to people is their immediate neighbourhood. It's the streets you live on, the shops you use, the parks you walk the dog in, and people really struggle to feel an identity much wider than that local neighbourhood. Some characterise Portsmouth of actually a series of micro villages, each with their own cultures. And I think a lot of cities and towns are actually like that. Also, we looked at all kinds of different factors that are risk factors that we know for social isolation, looking at multiple deprivation and heat maps. And even in 3 wards that are next door to each other, there's huge differences in the inequalities and some of the problems that people face. And we've recently had the review of Professor Malmer's look at health inequalities and the importance of the social gradient. So we can't just focus on those areas with the highest need. We really have to work across all the areas and in appropriate and sensitive ways to the needs of those communities. So we work with the Trust and the Commissioning Group, the Council, Health Education England and Portsmouth Hive, which is an umbrella coordination group for all the local community and voluntary sector organisations. And one of the biggest messages coming from local people is the complexity of the health and care system and how that alone can actually increase isolation and culminate in confusion about how to access services and actually result in increasing crises. We have seen more services going in to help people navigate this system, but it's really, really important if you're feeling isolated. And transport is a big issue. Even you'd think across a city like Portsmouth, it'd be easy to get about and travel. But for those people in the 3 northern wards, just going into the city centre could actually take up to an hour and a half on a bus. Some people couldn't afford even to do that. Taxis wouldn't take kids of a certain age unless they were escorted. If they were a young carer, it'd be really difficult for them to access support things in the city centre. But something we've seen is, and I think it's not just happened in Portsmouth, is the overall austerity over the last 10 years. There has been a kind of withdrawal of services into city centres and away from some of the outlying suburbs. And that's had a really big impact on people's local connections and the kind of support that helps them be less isolated. It's also cross-generational. We know this is a big issue for older people, but this is an issue for young people as well. It goes right across the life course, and all kinds of different groups of people are affected. And those things actually interact with each other. So, you know, sort of, if we don't have resources for young people to be occupied and doing things, and they start gathering, then other parts of people in the community can feel intimidated to go out. They don't want to go out of their homes so much. But if the kids have got nothing to go out to, they become isolated. So we really have to work with this across generations. And in terms of the workforce, and we spoke to a lot of frontline practitioners about what this means to them and how they work with this. And there are problems in identifying at-risk populations. I think everyone has some awareness now, particularly post-COVID, of the importance of being isolated and lonely. But we're still a bit behind the curve in some places in having really good metrics for frontline workers to know how to really identify at-risk populations and to recognise the risks at an earlier point. And we don't get in there to think of this enough in terms of prevention and early help for people. So there's sometimes a cycle of people reaching crisis point and we haven't intervened early enough. And we see that particularly when people perhaps can't get out of hospital in an appropriate time because there's no one to care for them back at their home, or they're isolated and can't get the right kinds of support. So we've really got to find ways to build this in across all of care pathways. So right from the start and the outset and across all the care pathways, we're thinking, where are we going to intervene and how are we going to recognise and support people to actually be less isolated? And alongside that, the ability to access local resources, local community groups, what the community monitoring sector is doing is really key, and how we actually equip a workforce to work with communities. We've moved, I think, over many years to working with individuals, and we can do that very successfully in terms of certain conditions. And we perhaps now need to think much more about a workforce that can actually do community development work more, can actually work with local community groups to support them and capacity build local people to make a difference. And one of the ways in the report you'll see that we describe this is we split it into what we called functional and structural approaches. And I think we do a lot of the functional stuff, and I'm not saying this isn't important, it is. We provide befriending schemes, daycare activities where people can get together, bereavement counselling for people who've recently lost a loved one. But these are things we do to people. And the evidence really supports that when it comes to addressing social isolation and loneliness, what we really need to do is promote things that enable people to develop their natural social integration more easily. Volunteering is a really, really good one for that in terms of getting people out and interacting with others, but also the importance of faith groups. And services are not always very good at working with community groups and faith groups particularly. Sport is a huge one. Kamlesh may well at the end want to talk about this being, I know how much she's been involved with cricket and things that has been going on there to develop community cohesion and support people to interact, but just being able to be part of sport is a huge thing. And these are natural ways to socially integrate. And what we have to do is get the balance right between all of this. So yes, we need to provide the services and they're important, but we've really got to also start as organisations to think, and particularly as anchor institutions and the NHS and local authorities, how we really support those green boxes on the right-hand side a lot more. In the action plan, and I won't go into the details, you can read it for yourselves in the report, but we've put it into sort of 3 broad responses. First of all, to raise awareness amongst all of the workforce, right across from library workers to people in sports centres to all kinds of community workers, to understand the issues and be able to recognise this and to know where they can signpost people for help. But we've got to do more than signposting. I think sometimes people are fed up of just being signposted. We've actually got to recognise the problems and equip people with the capacity and competencies to work with social isolation and loneliness with more effective methods of addressing that. And that enables us to respond in an effective way so that we can really make a difference, be doing that at earlier points and in a fully collaborative and integrated way. And I'll just finish by mentioning COVID-19 because I think this has really been hugely important. So I'm sure some of the great interest we've had today in this event has come from everybody now gets this. I think everyone understands just how difficult it is to be isolated, to be lonely, but also what happens in terms when you can't access services as you normally think to. We've got all the people that were isolated before COVID, but we've now got a huge amount of people who've become isolated much more and in different ways ever since. And we've got to be thinking about those groups and how we respond about this. Something that doesn't get a lot of talk is air quality, the reduction in traffic use. We've seen huge improvements in air quality in urban areas. It would be really, really great if we didn't all rush back to our cars and increase all that and really think a lot more about infrastructure and urban and rural design and planning, because the way that we build and the way that we design our environments are key to helping address social isolation and loneliness and the harms and risks associated with that. And we actually did some other work with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government on the Portsmouth piece, as they're thinking particularly about the importance of those areas. But I think going forward, and it'd be really good to hear their thoughts from people today, is how do we capture what we've learned from this pandemic? What's worked? What were the challenges that we faced? And how do we really embed the positive things that have come out of that in terms of the wide range of community activism, volunteering, the involvement of neighbours and local groups and people? We've really got to be able to sustain this, because I think there is a risk if we don't actively, across organisations, work with this and work with local people, some of that could be lost. For Breaking Barriers Innovations, we really want now to identify another 3 to 6 locations to take this work to another level and do some of that post-COVID learning, to do it on a fully collaborative basis where we put user voices at the heart of the whole piece, but actually build that up so that this can properly inform government policy going forward. And it should be bottom up. We know, I think all of us, that very often top-down strategies and approaches don't work very effectively. So hopefully we can build on that from today, explore all of this in another event, and how we support the immediate challenges and sustain long-term investment to do that. And we really welcome people to post questions on the chat box, but get in touch with us afterwards, and hopefully a lot of this can be discussed.
Great, thank you very much, John, for galloping through that huge amount of information, lots of nodding heads, lots of fascinating questions that popped up that I'm still plowing through. But before we get to some of them, I'm going to introduce Sue Harriman, who's been part of this project. So over to you, Sue. Are you unmuted?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kamlesh. And Thank you, John. Just to say, delighted to join today and to be part of the conversation and the learning. I thought I'd just talk about why Solent, why us, and why this felt right for us, really. We're obviously an NHS trust down in Hampshire, provide mental health, community, learning disability services across a lot of Hampshire, actually, but particularly in Portsmouth. We've been working with our partners around a model of integration, and we've got we believe, very effective integrated services with social care, primary care, the voluntary sector. We've got some wonderful enablers like a single clinical IT system that makes us think together, see the same information and work together, which gives us a wonderful platform for this work and this learning. We do have diverse communities. There is a lot of inequality and a lot of diversity. And the Solent vision for a number of years has been focused around people, very genuinely around people, our patients, our partnerships, the place that we work and our staff. And the aim is we want to help people to remain independent and healthy. I think the NHS historically has a traditional sort of paternalistic approach. We'll fix you, we know what's best for you, come into our organisation, we'll do something to you. And we really want to turn that on its head and have a bit of a paradigm shift, really, from an NHS perspective. So we talk about personalisation and about everybody being a unique individual. Individuals aren't a disease, they're not an issue, but that means we need to think really differently and pay attention to different things. So family, relationships, connections, where people live and how they live, the education, their employment, these are all factors that impact on health. But it isn't something that the NHS puts at the top of its agenda, and I think that's some of the learning from COVID that's so important. This slide really, we use a lot of storytelling in our organisation. We find it really powerful to sort of generate a rich picture of the people that we care for and work alongside. This is Ruby, one of our community sisters, and this is just one story out of a slide deck that I picked that just happens to really illustrate how loneliness has a massive impact on the health and outcomes of individuals. This is a gentleman who lives on his own, who wasn't managing his finances, wasn't eating properly, was neglecting himself. A very private man, but a lonely man, and couldn't connect into services. All of our patients that we care for have this level of complexity. They aren't somebody that comes into our services to receive care and disappears. They're somebody who leads a life with complexities. Oh, I can hear somebody in the background, actually. Anyway, we'll move on to the next slide, please, if you may.
People mute, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we move to the next slide? Lovely, thank you very much. I guess all of those reasons said, that's why we were delighted to be part of this piece of work, to work with Health Education England and BBI. And to be honest with you, over the last 18 months, we've been doing a bit of work with Kamlesh and John, really trying to challenge the way that we think so that we can actually be inclusive and have our communities right at the centre of everything that we do. And we've tried to do that in a number of ways. We've tried to stop consulting with our communities and trying to involve them and include them. And we're trying to give them some power and to really allow them to shape and influence the way we work and the way that we think. And to do that in collaboration with our partners. And I noticed there's many voluntary sectors today connecting in. What we found this before COVID, but particularly during COVID, that it's the power of our relationships and partnerships that's allowed us to think really fundamentally differently about how we can help individuals to lead their best life. And this focus on loneliness for us really does help us to kind of make the invisible visible. How do we put those individuals who are lonely and isolated in control and able to access the care, the services that they want in the way that they would want to? Can I move on to my fourth slide, please? I was asked to sort of reflect on the COVID experiences actually in the relation to isolation. Now, clearly, we've got an action plan that you'll see today in the playbook. And the action plan was generated just before COVID started. And the NHS, alongside all of you, has been incredibly busy over the last few months. So we've yet to really lean into that action plan, but there's been so much that's happened while we've been managing COVID that actually has started to embrace some of those actions already. I wanted to share with you about some of the learning for us during COVID. We've really seen inequality and vulnerability come to the fore in the way that we have to provide our services and the issues and risks that we are dealing with. We've seen the most vulnerable groups have become the most susceptible to COVID. And that's changed the way we think and the way we behave with partners. I think John mentioned our relationship with Hive, which is a partnership between ourselves, the CCG, and our voluntary sector. It's been a lifeline in the way that we've worked and behaved during the last few months. We've seen significant increases in referrals from our services into Hive and from Hive into our services, making those seamless connections. It's been really, really powerful. And we've also seen that actually there are other ways to connect. The traditional ways that the NHS have done in the past aren't always the right ones. Why should people get in a car and come to a facility? Why can't we connect in different ways through the community, using the technology, actually using telehealth, telecare, and by having those, generating those stories, by talking to and interviewing people who use our services, we've been able to shape that. But I think it does see, it has, as I say, shone this light on inequality. We've seen an increase in the need for our mental health services. We've seen an increase in psychological trauma from living with COVID, being isolated in communities. We've seen an increase in our safeguarding referrals and the levels of harm. And actually, we've seen that if people are disconnected and aren't able to access services, they are more vulnerable. And of course, for us, if somebody is vulnerable, their needs increase, they become more reliant on our services. And that isn't right, that's not sustainable. So really powerful messages. The picture, we've moved on to the last slide, but the picture I just wanted to talk about was a picture of our staff, a member there. And in their hands, they were holding up a badge. And we gave these to our staff to say, we thank you for everything you've done. We gave them to our staff, but we also said to our staff, we want you to gift these to people who have made a difference to you in your community. And can you share that on social media? And they did. You'll be really surprised who they shared their badges with. We had some dustmen who received a badge. We had teachers, we had neighbours, we had volunteers. It was just absolutely brilliant, that whole sense of community. So to my final slide, please, I just want to say we're really delighted with the work that we have done with BBI. We feel that it will take us to the next level. Our ambition is to continue to engage and listen, and loneliness and our connection with the people that we serve in our communities is really, really important to us. So that's me, and I will hand back to Kamlesh. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. I mean, I can see lots of people, so lots of nodding heads, lots of issues, loads of questions. One that's just popped up, and I think I'll just take it because it's just popped up, and it's probably for Sue. It's a question from somebody called Bob Allen, who says, a big challenge is identifying those that need additional support before they can be signposted to the appropriate services. How do you identify those that need your help? I suppose Sue and John, in a sense.
Yeah, and shall I start, John? Because this is a major challenge, I think, for us. The NHS has a number of tools, risk stratification tools, for example, but they tend to look through the lens of disease, comorbidities, as opposed to socioeconomic need, for example. So we found that there needs to be a real connection with the local community in those local neighbourhoods. Allows us to have that level of connection and intelligence, but there's so much more that we need to do. We just haven't got that right yet.
Super. Yeah, and it very much built into the action plan in terms of the kind of workforce development and skills and competence we need to develop for everybody around this area, not just health workers, but as you know, everyone that comes into interactions with people.
And I suppose it links into one of the questions a statement somebody talked about from Somerset, saying how they bring the voluntary sector and STPs to working together. Lots of other issues. I'm just going to end this little bit of the question time. We'll have an opportunity at the end, but just to, we've all seen the tube map with sort of how long you live from one end of the tube to the other. Gemma from Coventry said they have a bus route there that shows inequality in the city. Average age of death changes about 20 years from when you get off the bus to the other end. I think we just love that one because it really does make you think. We'll get a chance to have other questions to John and Sue, but I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Eleanor Roy, Policy Manager for Health and Social Care, CIPFA. Eleanor, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to contribute today to discuss something that CIPFA has a particular interest in. Oh, my slides, I seem to have finished.
That's really good.
That was brilliant, wasn't it?
Stop changing them.
I will say I've got no control over them, so I'll just keep going. I don't think with today's audience I have to do much convincing on the virtues of taking a place-based approach and a preventative approach. I think everybody that's signed into this does so because they recognise that place and prevention should really be at the heart of our approach to population health and well-being. Place, because clearly each locality is different, and as we've seen recently, there's been some good examples of where a centralised one-size-fits-all approach clearly doesn't work and take account of local circumstances. But also because population health involves almost all of the public services within a community. And many of the levers which influence health and well-being sit outside of the health service. So for example, housing, education, social care, public health, they all need to be targeted to best meet local needs. Prevention, because, well, it's better than cure, right? Clearly it's better for an individual to avoid having a health problem, but it's also much better for public services in terms of reducing future demand. And as recent experience has shown us, our public services need to be resilient and sustainable in order to withstand shocks. I'm not entirely clear what you all can see, but you've probably seen all of my slides now anyway, so I'll just keep going and you can do a jigsaw between the slides and what I'm saying. So place and prevention, unarguable, surely. The problem is our public services are not funded on the basis of place, and with limited resources available, the focus is often on meeting immediate demand rather than taking a preventative approach. We want to change the mindset around prevention. In times of austerity, it's understandable that it might be viewed as being an easy tap to turn off. Somewhere in that flickering mass of slides, there's a quote from our chief exec on that topic exactly. Rather, we believe it should be viewed as a true investment. There we go, we're on, nope, we're gone again. We believe prevention should be viewed as a true investment, yielding benefits across both place and time. And indeed that it's an investment that we can't afford not to be making. This aim to change the mindset was the rationale behind work we did with Public Health England to try and improve how preventative investments are evaluated. The work focused mainly on public health because it's the easiest area in which to identify how much preventative spend there actually is. but we emphasise in the work that the concept can apply and should apply across all public services. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go into detail on the framework. I understand finance is not everybody's favourite subject, and I myself am not an accountant. So if we get too far into the technicalities, I'm not the right person to be talking to in the first place. What I do want to do is talk through some of the headlines on what it tries to address. So why is there a problem with prevention? Well, there's a few issues. The full benefits of preventative approaches might take years or even in some cases decades to materialise. And not to be cynical, but this involves a commitment beyond the average political cycle. Meeting the immediate demand for services might seem more urgent. Therefore, we find that there's a tendency often towards taking a short-term view. There's also a cross-organisational problem in that the benefits and costs of taking a preventative approach might fall on different bodies. So, for example, a council who've had their funding cut over the last decade might not be too keen to invest in a programme which would mainly reduce access to service demand in the health service. So we need to clarify the incentives and look across these boundaries to identify shared goals and think about getting the best value for the place-based public pound. As one of our stakeholders in this work said, organisational structures might change, but Durham isn't going anywhere. And we need to be thinking about how the public money is spent on that basis. Related to this, there's often a language barrier in terms of how programmes are evaluated across different sectors. So, for example, the health sector often evaluates projects on the basis of quality of life, which is understandably an area that no one is keen to attach a pound sign to. However, this may not be as well understood by players in other sectors, where evaluations tend to be more economic or financial in nature, making these cross-sector conversations more difficult. So the evaluation needed to be in a common language that's understood by all the people making the decisions. Now, it's suspected that there's significant disinvestment in prevention across the board, that the tap is quite often turned off, but it's very difficult to evidence because it's very difficult to see. It's felt that the bar is set higher for preventative approaches, that they have to deliver all the bells and whistles and show cash savings on top of that, or they just don't get support to be taken forward. We argue that the risks of not making preventative investment should be made explicitly clear in evaluations. What is the impact or cost if we don't act now to secure the future? So how do we make the case? You'll be glad to hear I've now caught up on my slides. The saying goes that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We need to be able to see the whole system to view the value of the public pound in a place and how it can be best invested to have greater impact. We need to look across those organisational borders. We need robust, consistent and transparent and balanced evaluations of prevention, the costs and benefits, where they fall and the risk of not investing. This would enable a clearer vision and a common language to inform better decision making. And a consistent approach to evaluation would make the levels of investment in prevention more visible across place and time, so we could see what investments are or are not being made, making any short-termism more explicit and transparent. Finally, we need to take a holistic view of each investment and its long-term impact, with an emphasis on ensuring our public services are financially sustainable for the future. Taking such a common and consistent approach would enable specific preventative interventions to be considered on a place-based basis, but it might also help to quantify future problems which require a preventative solution. If we can move on to the next slide, please don't take the quote as an endorsement of its speaker. I don't want to get into the politics involved there at all, it's just a really good quote. Many organisations have plans in place which espouse a focus on prevention, but it's quite difficult to follow the money. If prevention is truly valued, we believe this should be evident in the budgets and financial statements of an organisation. We should be able to see that in how they are spending public money. The work done by Breaking Barriers and the playbook approach is extremely valuable in this regard because it brings together all the players in a community and looks at how they can come together in a targeted manner to really make a positive impact. And I think it's a great evidence base that clearly demonstrates how the place-based approach can succeed. As we begin to shape the post-COVID new normal, place and prevention must always be at the forefront of our minds and our financial plans. And recent experience has highlighted quite clearly, I think, that prevention is a tap we can no longer afford to turn off. Thanks again for allowing me to speak today, and if there are any questions, I will do my best.
Eleanor, many apologies about the wackiness of the slides, but this
That's quite all right.
In the new normal.
It almost reflects my mindset anyway. I tend to flit around quite a lot. So
that makes a few of us. It's such an important topic because, you know, I'm sort of looking at all the words and trying to paraphrase some of the questions, but I like accountants. I don't have a problem with them, but you know, you have a job to do in the NHS or a big organisation, and it's about meeting that immediate priority. And you can't put a pound, shilling, or pence on something you can't see or feel. How are you going to how can we make some of our finance directors come on board and see the value of this work, what you said about balancing prevention and seeing the investment?
Sorry, Kalash, could you repeat that? My connection broke up just a tiny bit.
How can we get some of our finance directors around the country who are feeling enormous amounts of pressure just to solve the immediate problem, to sort of realise and understand the value of prevention and investing now and not seeing a return for a while?
That's a really good point. And actually the way that we presented the work that we did, the publication came out last year and there's a link there to it. But the way that we presented it was as a framework targeted at senior finance professionals across the public service to try our framework and meet the challenge. We worked with a lot of stakeholders, including from the finance profession across the board, and at no point did we hear any of them express the view that it wasn't important. It was almost that there wasn't room for it, and there was a lack of evidence, if you like, to make the financial case, and that where it is made, it's done so in a very different way in different sectors. So that's exactly the question that we asked, and we put the framework out there almost as a challenge to them to come back and tell us how it worked in terms of working across organisations, because that was the biggest problem. The different parts of the public sector often operate different financial systems. So it's getting those cross-sector conversations going in a way that everybody understands. That's the challenge.
I think there's lots and lots of positive comments about the fact you're championing the idea from a financial sense on prevention and a place-based approach. And I would recommend to people to try and look at this framework document that CIPFA have produced. It's a really good guide and helpful. Thank you, Eleanor. Sorry about the wackiness of the slides.
Quite all right. Thanks very much.
We'll share it with people. And we'll come back later for more questions. I'm going to move on to Sarah now. Sarah, very sensibly, is not going to use slides. Probably, unlike all of us. Sarah, over to you. Sarah White.
Thank you. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that the headshot photo background is very similar to the wall that I'm currently sat in front of, because IT issues mean that you can't have access to all of your files. Thank you so much for having me and representing Sense and the people we support on this call. I think it's been really interesting already hearing a lot of the trends that have come through from the report and from the previous speakers, and a lot of that actually reflects what I was already going to say, which is always lovely when that happens. So a bit about Sense. We're a national disability charity. We provide care and support for 2,000 people, but much more support for a much wider number of people including for the residential support to virtual buddying programs, to sports activities, and the whole kit and caboodle. We've been interested in loneliness for many, many years because we were aware that the people we support and disabled people more broadly experience much higher levels of loneliness and social isolation. We were delighted to be part of the foundation, the commission, and worked with Jo before she died, and then we're able to continue that work, highlighting specifically the barriers that disabled people face when accessing social opportunities. And we also worked and led a kind of coalition of other disability charities working together to highlight this together. I think when we look at the causes of loneliness for disabled people, that it breaks down into a few categories. One of them is around lack of services, and I think we've kind of talked about services in different ways throughout this meeting already. So John was talking about, formal services versus the more informal community-based services. But what we see is that with cuts to social care budgets, we're seeing fewer and fewer people receiving the care and support that they need. We also see a really interesting hierarchy of need that crops up. So a lot of the people who we support might not have physical disabilities, but have sensory impairments or need support to communicate. They might not communicate using a formal form of communication that we would, such as speech. And so actually what we're finding is that those services that we view as preventative, that are enabling people to communicate, to get out into the community, often aren't happening. They're not, as interesting what Eleanor was saying about prevention, they're often not seen as preventative services, but they are, we view them that they are, but they are those lower level interventions that are just not happening anymore. And again, it's really hard to evidence that, but that's what we see. So lack of social care or what those kind of support services to enable people to access their communities is a really big factor for many. Alongside that, we have the fact that a lot of mainstream opportunities just aren't accessible for disabled people. So lots of really nice community projects and innovations might be hosted in buildings that aren't physically accessible, can't be accessed via public transport. We've talked about transport infrastructure already, or again, talking about communication, would there be an interpreter present? Would you need support to go to those community-based events? But again, your support's been cut, so you can't get there. And then the third area that we see kind of coming in is actually around public stigma and public understanding and awareness. As part of the research we did for the Commission and Foundation, we found that half of non-disabled people feel that they have nothing in common with a disabled person, and that that quarter of people had avoided a conversation, often through fear of getting it wrong. But actually there's something we really need to break down and find more opportunities for disabled and non-disabled people to spend time together, shared activities and shared focus. And again, that's then looking at how do we make those opportunities more inclusive so that that can happen and that can be fostered. We can't really talk today without talking about COVID. I think it's been a really challenging time for us as an organisation. Many of the people who we support have obviously seen a change in how services are delivered, have not been able to see their families. And we've also seen some really specific challenges come up around PPE and people who rely on facial expressions to communicate, not being able to do so. But many of the people who we support also receive and give communication via tactile cues and touch. And that's just something that's really challenging to do at the moment. And how do we do that in a safe way? We've also found that there's a kind of real cohort of people who we're really concerned about as we move forwards, who are those people who live at home and who are maybe supported by friends or family, but who would normally access community-based day services, go to access their community, and those services just haven't been running. They are probably the most financially vulnerable in many ways, from what we've seen in terms of how the funding is working. And also they're not going to be the same when they restart because of social distancing. So we're looking at how we manage the capacity of some of our day services and how do we continue to give the same level of support to people when we can't have physically as many people in the building. I think it has been a real opportunity, and we've seen some people who have really developed new skills. We've moved a lot of our support online. which has amazing benefits for some people. It doesn't work for everybody, but we have been able to kind of broaden that offer. And we're very grateful to be in receipt of some funding from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which is going to help us scale up that online offer. So we've got a buddying programme that usually runs face-to-face in East London. We've put that online, we're expanding that, we're looking at ways we can connect more and more people together. I think as we move forwards as well, it's about the narrative of what social care is. I think we've seen a lot of chat about social care being for older people and care homes, but actually, a third of people accessing adult social care are working as disabled people, and that really hasn't been recognised in government policy. We still have our supported living services who we can't get testing for because that doesn't count as social care in the government policy, and I think there's kind of still a way to go there. It was really refreshing to hear Sue talk about that real personalised model around delivering health and care and in the community, because I think there is a real risk that we could move towards a much more medical model because COVID is a virus, it has a medical impact, and actually the societal impact is so much more. But again, the social care has been talked about as supporting the NHS to handle COVID or supporting discharge, and actually it's so much more than that, and so we need to really pick that up. I think as well we've seen quite a few legislative changes that we are concerned about, that we would want to have unpicked before we move forwards. But overall, COVID, as I say, it's been an opportunity, but we are really aware that there are lots of people out there who are lonely, who were lonely before, and who are and people who are now lonely because of COVID. And how do we reach those people? We know of many people who normally be very independent, wouldn't normally seek support or services, would access their community quite confidently, but have, because of social distancing, changes in how shops are laid out and delivered, how you can and can't go to places. I mean, getting lots of calls from people who just feel so anxious about going out and feel they've lost that confidence. And so, but also losing those connections. So those things and opportunities that might have been really easy and at hand are no longer there. So we're thinking very much about how we we reach those people. So I think just to kind of sum up, when it comes to how can we be ensuring that disabled people's needs are met as we look at a lot of this stuff, I think it really is that we've talked about place-based already. I think that really is key. There are some great local disability groups, disabled people-led organisations who know what they need. But I think it's also about looking at who you're not hearing from, as ever, who isn't engaged, who do we need to be trying to reach? How can we be making those mainstream offers more accessible? If we're doing online events, could we look at having live captioning like this event has today, so that someone who's deaf or hard of hearing can join? If we're doing activities, how can we make those more accessible just in the mainstream, so that we don't have activities, events or groups for disabled people and activities, groups and events for non-disabled people, because that actually interests cut across, and going back to that stigma point, we really need to break down those barriers. I think sometimes there are specific interventions that need to be made or done, but it's about joining those together and looking at what the community is already doing. I think often when you look in a local area, there will be someone who's providing that support. How can we support those smaller groups to expand their offers and to be able to reach more people? So that's kind of all that I had to say, really, but it's really good to be able to be talking about disabled people and how they fit into some of this, because I think if we get it right for disabled people, we get it right for a lot more people, because actually making things more accessible, more inclusive works for everybody, and it means we have much more richness in terms of who we're engaging with, and hopefully together we can tackle isolation and loneliness across the board. Thank you.
Sarah, from my point of view, you've taken it to another level. I think just give us some really stark reminders of how easily we can forget about some people. There's lots and lots of questions. I've got a few specifically for you, but I wonder if the whole panel will come back, so we'll go into the panel discussion, because I think some of the questions arising from yours affect others as well. A couple of interesting ones just for you, Sarah. Would you say that people who have hidden disabilities, who often have had to learn to mask their conditions, are often missed when it comes to disability because people don't understand the level of their social isolation or need? That's a tough one.
Yeah, I think that is true. We often see this event is accessible. There's a ramp to the front door. And actually, that's great. But accessibility is so much more. And I think what we have seen, particularly during COVID, is a lack of understanding at policy level of disability. And as you said, that masking of people who get on with it most of the time, but who are no longer able to get on with it because of the rules that have changed. And I think that's been really key. Lots of people, as I said, would have been independent who've had that taken away. I think as well, we've seen that around things like face coverings and the policy that was announced last week around wearing face coverings in shops and the exemptions to that. And as we've already know of people who've had quite a lot of hate crime for not wearing a mask, even though they are on the exemptions list. And we had a story over the weekend of two deafblind sisters who had lowered their mask to communicate because that's how they communicate, and experienced hate crime on the train. And I just think I think there's a lot of people who before would maybe not have identified themselves as disabled, who now feel that they are disabled because of the changes that have been brought in.
Really important. So something I suppose we need to log as a big issue and to take on the policy stage, because it can easily be forgotten. Claire Thompson mentioned, we've probably had BAME communities and LGBT communities being affected more during COVID. Links quite well into one of the Breaking Barriers projects that we're doing on marginalised communities, because we have a perception of what marginalised community is, and it's interesting, we're seeing very different definitions of marginalised communities. Peter Greenwood asked if you would share the survey about the attitudes of people with disabilities. I think there were some, as he called, quite shattering figures there. I mean, shattering figures. So that'd be really helpful if you could share that.
Yeah, it was part of the report that we did for the Jo Cox Commission when we led a month of awareness around disability. So I'll find the link and put it in the chat so that everyone has it, and it's part of the introductory stats in there. But it's also got some really good case studies around disabled people sharing their experiences of loneliness and social isolation as well.
Two questions for the whole panel, and Sarah sort of mentioned it, and it sort of instigated a number of responses around transport being a key issue to loneliness and isolation. Just a general question to the panel about what their view on it is, what they think about transport issues, how can we begin to deal with it? And secondly, Caroline asks, some people have been in locked down for a long time and affected really badly about it. How do we get them to take those first steps? Is there any examples of good practice about how we get them out of that front door? So anybody can start.
Yeah, I mean, in all the people we've spoken to, transport has come up as a really important issue, and I think we still underestimate the cost impacts of public transport for people that are struggling, living at the breadline. If they're already using food banks, they're probably much less likely to pay for public transport. We drive a lot of transport from very strong economic models and don't sufficiently balance that with the social goods of transport. And so very often areas lose out because they're not viewed as economically viable transport hubs. And I think we've got to think very differently about how we actually move around in our communities. Again, back to the idea of place and what that means about being local, how we actually have things more within reach of people. We've got a drive going on at the minute to get more people cycling, and there's the exercise benefits from all of that. But it's about being able to connect and reach other people as much as, losing weight or health benefits.
Any of our other speakers want to mention about transport? No, that's okay. Any examples about, and I suppose it comes back to you, Sarah, about, people who've really have been probably lonely before, but now after COVID, it's, I walked into a shop the other day and felt uncomfortable because I haven't been in one for ages, how do we begin to help with that? And first steps, do we, you know, it must be more difficult for SENS to do than other organisations.
Yeah, and I think it's about how we make sure it's addressed, because I think, as you say, we're all feeling it. We all feel the change in routine and the confidence. Yeah, it is all there. I think for us, what we found is that there hasn't been much recognition of that at a kind of national policy level. I think it's very much everything's open, go to the restaurants, it's fine, because that's the public narrative, and I can understand why that is. But I think we are really, we're working with government and saying we need to see a kind of action plan about how we're going to support people to get back into life. We did some work around disabled children and their parents as part of a wider partnership that we're in, and found, I think it was 75% of families had all their care and support cut, all of it, during COVID. And actually, that isn't going to be something you can just switch back on. But also for a lot of those children and more people who we support, there's a period of adaptation there, particularly if you've got a learning disability or autism. How can we be supporting people to, kids going back to school? A lot of disabled children haven't been at school at all throughout. Come September, just going straight back to school 9 to 5. I mean, it's not going to happen, unfortunately, I don't think. But also, if it did, that's not something we can do overnight. And so how can we be clearly communicating to families and people that we acknowledge the challenges that they face? I think acknowledgement is a big first step, and then kind of put in place a plan that's longer term, that isn't just lifting lockdown, but is about additional support and packages and bits that we can put in along the way.
Very helpful. One last question to the whole panel, but I might pick on Sue with this one, is what role is there in all this for technology? Now, I pick on Sue, I suppose, in the sense, because for years we've tried to get the NHS to use technology. I think we've probably achieved 10 years work in about 10 weeks.
Yeah, completely. We have learned so much, actually, not least about how hard it is to change anything in the NHS, because it took COVID and the crisis for us to work differently, and it has revolutionised the way that we work. So, as an example, many people for years and years going into hospital for an outpatient appointment, those have reduced enormously. And often because the appointment actually wasn't needed in the first place, or indeed there's another way to connect, or indeed we can support people to make choices for themselves rather than doctor says or nurse says. So I think the NHS has a long way to go with this digital strategy, but I think it is part of the revolution for us. And I think it actually does play to the point around connectivity as well. I think particularly if you think around, and it's not just the younger generations that embrace the tech and the digital. I think we underestimate how connected we could be by using the technology, and actually we can deliver so much of what the NHS does through technology as well. It will make us more efficient, more effective. It will increase our scope. So I think there's been enormous learning, and I hope that the thought leadership in the investment continues when we move away from the COVID crisis.
Super. I'm going to push it and ask one more question just to open it up. What's the role of community assets, things like parks, making them more safe for everyone? Anybody?
Well, I'll start from a health perspective. I think one of the things that's come through the learning of COVID, we knew this already, but it's put a focus on obesity and choices around what we eat and how we exercise. Now, in the city of Portsmouth, there is very, very little green space, green open space. And I think if it's going to become a legitimate part of our approach to health and well-being, we can't just say to people, go and get on a bike, off you go, here's £50. We need to provide a raft of different options for people to make choices about how they find green space, how they exercise, how they start to look after themselves. I think should be a major part of health policy and NHS policy moving forward.
Really important point to end on there. And one to tell our finance secretors, Eleanor, probably as well, in terms of, planting some trees and having some grass outside the hospital.
Absolutely, and completely agree with what Sue said. I mean, we've looked at quite a few places that have taken an asset-based approach, and I think the one that stands out for us is what's happening in Wigan with the Wigan deal, and part of that is related to health and well-being, around social prescribing, etc. But actually, the council has taken it much wider and spanned it across their entire service. And it's a brilliant example of what you can achieve just by looking at what you already have and joining the dots.
Super. And that takes me on to make one final comment before I hand over to Kim and let her finish closing remarks. Clearly, just from everything the speakers have said, and fantastic, you'd hear a big round of applause if we could. So just listen to that. The stadium's booming. We mustn't lose. We've had over 120 people here today. If we can try and keep this together, keep connected, there's so many examples of good practice that we can build on and share, and we'll try and help and work with the Commission to try and get this going for our part. But it's been really, really enlightening. Thank you to all our speakers. Kim, I'm going to let you have the final say.
Thank you very much, Lord Patel. Yeah, I mean, that was absolutely brilliant, and I can't thank our speakers enough. Some really insightful stuff there, really inspiring to hear what's going on in different places up and down the country. I don't really know where to start with my summary. I've got so many notes written down here, but I'll have a go. The hashtag for today's session, and the hashtag that we've been using for the Connection Coalition, is Community Makes Us. And I think today we've seen a lot of evidence around that. Community does make us. We've seen that during lockdown. We've seen that around the pandemic. John referred to the bottom-up approach, and I absolutely agree. We have to have that bottom-up approach, but it does need to be combined with the top-down stuff as well. And that's the only way we're going to make deep and meaningful change on so many of these important issues. And that's why, as the Jo Cox Foundation, as the Connection Coalition, we will do everything we can to support every single person and organisation on this call today, because we do have a voice in Westminster, we do have connections with politicians, and we will keep pushing for policy change on important issues around loneliness, social isolation, and the other factors around it, around mental health and well-being, grief, sadly, which is going to be such an important issue going forward, issues around disability. So we do have that voice, but I'm also very proud of the grassroots network that we've got through the Jo Cox Foundation and through the Connection Coalition. The stuff that we're doing locally in Batley and Spen with the team of volunteers that we have up here really resonates with a lot of the things that John talked about in terms of health inequalities, in terms of local identity. People do identify very much with their direct local area, and it's what we can do in terms of action at that very localised level. The big things for me really, cross-sector approach. Straight away in lockdown, the voluntary sector rose up. The voluntary sector did what the voluntary sector does. It went, hang on, we need to take some action. It did it brilliantly. We had a fairly few frustrating meetings with the council, who were also trying to act quickly, but it's not as easy for the council often to act quickly, is it? But the voluntary sector does it brilliantly. So we have to work together. We work running around filling forms in and doing data protection issues. The council has to do that stuff, but the voluntary sector doesn't, so we have to work together. We also have to look at the private sector to see where we can get support from businesses, because we've got some very good local businesses who want to support and we'll do that. Going forward, I think, again, so cross-sector approach, that's something I feel passionately about. Going forward, again, just been referred to there, we have to be looking at online stuff and offline stuff. One isn't a substitution for the other. We've seen amazing things happening now online. We're going to be involved in a local project around digital inclusion. I think that's really important going forward, how we can get people who are not digitally engaged for those that want to, but it's no substitution for meeting in person, is it? So the sooner we can look at how we can safely get those community activities going on face-to-face in person again, that's really, really important. We need joined up thinking around loneliness. That's a really important thing, isn't it? So it needs to be looking at all the different groups in society who might be vulnerable to feeling lonely. and all the issues around that. We did a loneliness conference up here in West Yorkshire just before lockdown. That was really powerful. It got people from across the area, from the small voluntary organisations right up to the council leaders together to have those important conversations, and we're going to keep that going. We're also looking at doing a project around mental health specifically, but clearly the integration of the mental health issue and the issue of loneliness, they're very, very close, aren't they? Somebody talked about having opportunities, having platforms to do things, and I think that's absolutely right. Sometimes people just need to be given a platform to connect. That's what we try and do through the Great Get Together, which we do in June, and we did very successfully this year, offline and online. We will be doing the Great Winter Get Together, which we'll be doing around December time. Again, we will be providing a platform there through that campaign for people to come together. So if you want an opportunity, if you want a reason to connect people who you work with within your communities, use the Great Winter Get Together to do that. We're still working on the detail, and obviously it will depend on where we are in terms of social distancing, but that's a great platform to use. We're also developing more in common groups across the country. So these are voluntary groups that we're developing at a very local level. Again, this is a group that I chair in Batley and Spen, but we have groups in Darlington and Basildon and Boston and all over the place. We're trying to grow that network. And that really is about building strong, compassionate, well-connected communities where everyone has a sense of identity and belonging. And for me, loneliness is part of that, but actually it's about much more than that. It's about looking at other serious issues that we face around cohesion, around gang culture, knife crime, other issues for young people. It's around, it really makes me so sad that Sarah said that thing, and I don't have anything in common with a disabled person. Oh, it makes me so sad. Of course you do. But what you might not have had is the opportunity to meet someone with a disability. And equally, you might not have had the opportunity to meet someone who's gay or black, but those differences, when you get an opportunity to come together, they don't matter. It's that common ground that really binds us together as human beings. So we need to be looking at those opportunities and those platforms. So yeah, I mean, gosh, I could go on, and I'm not going to, because everybody's probably desperate for their lunch. But just know that, the people on this call, you are doing amazing things. And through the Jo Cox Foundation and the Connection Coalition, we will do whatever we can to support you. We're only a small team, but, we're like Jo, we're small and we're mighty, and we'll do whatever we can to help with the really important work that you're doing. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm not going to even attempt to say anything after that. That was wonderful. Keep safe, everyone. Hopefully, we will meet in person soon sometime. All the best. Bye-bye.